All right. Hey, so in this video, we're going to be talking about A-frame components. And these are a pretty critical thing in A-frame because it allows us to define our own data and behaviors in A-frame. So the A-frame component is reusable. You can attach it to any or all objects in your A-frame scene. And you can think of it as like it's just some sort of container that has a bunch of data and functions attached with it. The data describes the properties, and then the function also describes the operations or what your object will be able to do when this component is attached to it. So a good example of this is maybe you want to have data logging capabilities for your A-frame scene. So maybe for research, you want to log the position and the rotation and maybe even the speed of your object throughout the duration of your experiment. So what you would do is you would define a component and you would give it an operation to log data and then maybe save that data to a CSV or an Excel file on your computer. So again, you can add these things to all sorts of things like an A box, an A camera, A cylinder, even just an A entity. You can even make one for your A scene. So, all right, there's two types of components. There are single property and multi-property components. And in these examples, we have a single property component called position, which you're probably very familiar with by now. And then you have a multi-property component called leap hand. And this might be familiar if you looked through the Leap Motion controller tutorial, but there were software developers who created a GitHub repository that gives us a JavaScript code or a component called leap hand that allows us to use the Leap Motion controller with A-frame, and we can see our hands and interact with the environment. So all right, in the single property component, you'll notice we're just giving it a value. That's it. We're not giving it any property names or anything. It's just one value because it only has one property. So in this case, it's a vector in 3 dimensions. So you have your X, your Y, and your Z. And then in your multi-property, you have multiple properties in there. So you have hand and you have enable physics. It could be a lot more or less than that or whatever. But the point here is that the property and value pairs are divided by semicolons. And then the property name and the value you're assigning to it is separated by a colon. So in this case, the property name is hand and you're assigning it the value left because it's either left or right. And then enable physics is just a Boolean. So that property name is there, and then the value is a Boolean. So it's either true or false. All right. So you're probably wondering, how do we even write these components and how do we even use them? So, and another question you probably had was, what do they look like? So this is what the base code for an A-frame component looks like. So you'll notice that there are 2 arguments we're passing to it. Well, first of all, in order to create a component, you have to call A-frame dot, and this means that you're calling its function, one of its functions, dot register component. So this is basically enabling you to create your own component. Now, the first argument here that I'm circling over is the name of the component. So if you want your component to be position or leap hand, you would put in there position or leap hand, or maybe for the data logging example, you would put data logging or log. So for the name. Now, the second argument to this function seems a little bit daunting, and I understand that. It has a lot of parts to it, but it's really not too bad. And the second argument is essentially is the definition. It's our actual component. So, all right. Now, where do you even put this code? So there's 2 ways you can do it. I'm actually going to go over the second option first because that's just the quickest, easiest way to do it. All you do is you take that A-frame.register component code and you put it in a script element in the head element of your A-frame HTML file. That's it. You just take that code, you write it, and you put it right there, and that's all you do. In the first option, it's a little bit cleaner, a little bit more organized. So essentially, you're taking your A-frame.register component code and you're putting it in a completely separate file. And it's going to be a JavaScript file. So the extension is going to be .js. So I named my file applesauce.js. So, and another good rule of thumb is if the name that you give in your register component function, like that first argument, should be the same name that you use to name the file. So if your name of your component is applesauce, you should probably name the JavaScript file applesauce.js. And then essentially what you do is in the head element, you're using a script element again, but you're defining, you're declaring the attribute src, which is technically also a component. So attributes and components are the same thing. And then you're assigning it the name of your file. Now, the last thing to mention is the location of your file is very important. It's recommended that you put your JavaScript file in the same location as your HTML file. Otherwise, this won't work. All right. So in the beginning, if you remember, I said that components have data and they also have functions. So component properties are basically the data. And you'll notice that schema was the one part of the definition here that does not have the function keyword next to it because it's not a function. All it is it's just a bunch of data that you're giving this component. So again, in the schema, you write the data in there differently depending on whether you want it to be single property or multi-property. And each property also has a name or a value. This is really important when you're doing multi-property components in the schema because you have to assign the data to different names or property names. In single property, it doesn't matter. There's only one property, so you don't have to give it a name. And you'll see that in this example right here. So we're registering a component called calc, short for calculator or whatever. And you'll notice in our schema, it's just one thing. So we're giving it a type of number. Now there's a bunch of other types you can use like color. You can use a string of characters, which is basically a word or whatever, or a string. And in this case, we just want the user to give it a number. So you'll notice also too, I can define something called a default. Now the default is really handy because if the user forgets to assign a number to that attribute or component once I define it, then it'll just give the 3.14 value to it automatically. So in the right-hand side, this is what you would see in your body of your HTML file. So you have your A entity, and you can apply your component or attribute to any A entity or scene or object or whatever. And you'll notice as an attribute, I'm calling calc equals, and it's single property. So I'm only giving it a value. And in this case, I'm assigning it the 2.71 number. All right, this is a multi-property example. So just for fun, I'm creating a component called truck. And in the schema, you'll notice that it's written a little bit differently. So I now have a name for a property followed by more brackets. And in these brackets, just like before, I'm also putting in the type and maybe a default as well. And yes, I understand 100 horsepower is not a lot, but let's just, that's just the default for now. I could have made it 200, but when I made the slides, I made it 100, which, you know, it is what it is. Anyway, I made the type integer, which is just another kind of number. So number can have decimal values and stuff like that, but integer can only be like numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, no decimal values. And then for color, I obviously did type color and I defaulted it to this value. I can't remember if that means black or if that means white, but I can't remember, but I just know it's one of those two. And then again, on the right-hand side is what you would see in your ascene if you're applying truck to an entity or an object. So you have truck and then equals, and then in your quotation marks, again, you have your property name and value pairs separated by a semicolon, and there could be 3 of these, 4 of these, whatever. It could be as many as you want, or as many as you define in your schema. Horsepower, I made it a little bit better. I made it 200. And then in the color, again, I can't remember if this means black or if it means white, but it's one of those two. All right. If you still need a little bit more guidance or help with this, there is 2 more websites there for you when you get to the slides. Those really helped me out a lot. And of course, I used them a little bit to write this video and tutorial. So, all right. So now we're on to the rest of the component definition. So these are all the functions or the operations that our component will actually have. So init is the first one we'll go over really quick. And again, I'm only going to go over these really quick because the main point of this video is to just give you the basic idea of what a component is, where to use it in your code, and things like that. I won't go into too much detail about what to actually put in these brackets because I'm probably going to make an activity that's going to teach you what kind of JavaScript to put in those brackets. But there's also resources at the end of the slides that really are very helpful for that. So, but we'll just go over these functions really quickly. And yeah, so the first one is init, which is really short for initialization. So whenever you write code in this function, the code is going to execute once when the scene starts up or when the component is created. That's it, only once when it's initialized. And a good thing to use the initialization function for is when you're trying to set the component's initial state or initialize and set your variables in the beginning. All right. Update. So update is pretty interesting because this function, if you write code in here, the code will execute every time a change is made to your component. So let's say maybe the component is moved, or maybe something else changes its color, or it's grabbed. The code in the update function will then get called. An example of changing a component is using the .set attribute. So that's one example of how to change a component. And again, the main purpose of this is just to modify the entity or the component in some way. All right, tick is interesting, and it might actually be very useful for the data logging with the research. So tick is very cool because it's called 60 to 120 times every second. And the reason for that is because a frame is 1/60th or 1/120th of a second in a frame. So it's going to get called every one of those frames. And really, the main use for this is you could check the state of the entity with every tick. Again, like I said, you can use it to log data, possibly, maybe the position and the rotation of the object that the component is attached to. And you could also use it to modify the entity at every frame. All right, remove. So you might remember this from this first slide here. Remove is basically when the component dies, or the entity that the component is attached to dies. Again, it can be deleted by using remove attribute or remove child. These are just functions that you can use in A-frame. And again, remove is interesting because you can use this to delete or undo any modifications that were made to the component before it was deleted. Kind of like a cleanup action kind of thing. But you can also use this to remove any event listeners. Now, some of you might not know, some of you might not know what an event listener is. Essentially, an event listener really quickly is like It's basically a block of code that just waits until something specific happens. So maybe you're waiting for an object to get picked up. Maybe once it's picked up, a sound will play. So the event listener is designed such that it'll play a sound, but only if the object is picked up. And in this case, this is removing that event listener. All right, so pause. Pause is used when you're using entity.pause or scene.pause, you're obviously just pausing the entity or you're pausing the scene. And this code, obviously, when you put it in here, it's going to execute when the scene or the entity that the component is attached to is paused. And a good use for pause is sometimes with your component, it's going to be continuously computing operations that it would have. But maybe when the scene or the entity is paused, you want that to stop through the scene.pause or the entity.pause. Then it'll halt those operations. And again, just like remove, it's also good at removing or deleting any event listeners that you don't want happening anymore once it's paused. All right, so the last one, really quick. So play. If you put any code in here, essentially this code will get executed. Obviously, if you call entity.play or scene.play, after it's already been paused. So maybe this the entity that this component was attached to or the scene was already paused, and then you hit play to resume it. And maybe in that pause function, you removed an event listener. So this can add that event listener back once you resume it. All right, and that's basically it for the components. Now, I'm going to go over this a little bit. So the links or the documentation that is highlighted in red, or not red, orange, I highly recommend you go over these. I would almost even consider it like an assignment to just at least glaze over these. These resources will really help you to hone in your skills with writing the JavaScript for these functions. So like what you would actually put within these brackets for the function. It gives you really important keywords, how to access certain elements or how to access parts of the scene, things like that. Obviously, like the first one in orange, it tells you how to write a component. And it also gives you the application programmer interface help as well. And essentially what an application programmer interface is it's code that someone else wrote. And basically it's making it easier for you to compute certain operations or whatever. So maybe the API is for maybe like stock market stuff. So it gives you functions or data that you can use in your code. So instead of you writing all of that code yourself, you can just use the API, and then maybe they have a function that they define themselves, like, I don't know, get stocks or something like that. And yeah, so and then basically for this, there was some API written for the JavaScript events in A-Frame. And again, it's the idea that you don't have to write all that yourself. There are some functions and data that you can call to make your code shorter and simpler and easier to read. So, all right. So yeah, on top of the activity that I'll probably assign to this video, I would definitely recommend going to those. The last thing I'll say is at the bottom there is extra JavaScript help, and that you can really just look at it a little bit. You don't have to look at it much, but that's just there in case you're more interested in JavaScript. So, all right. I know that that might have been a lot of new stuff for you, but just get through the activity. If you have any questions, let me know. Make sure you really look over these. These helped me a lot in the beginning. At first, I didn't know what I was doing, and these helped me out a lot and understand what's going on. So, all right. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions or concerns, just let me know. And that's it. So see ya.